Hello and welcome to Topic 11, Lecture 1, where we're going to be looking at forms of political participation. So what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? First, we're going to look at what your textbook calls traditional forms of political participation. Then we're going to look at probably the most traditional form of political participation, which is voting, and we'll look at some of the restrictions and reforms that have been leveled on voting through the course of the history of the United States. In our next lecture, we're going to be taking a look at more contemporary reforms to voting, making it more convenient, and some of the backlash to that. And then we're going to take a look at a non-traditional form of political participation, which your textbook identifies as digital political participation. So let's get started. Okay, so to get us thinking about political participation, I want you to think about the ways that you have participated in politics. In other words, how have you participated in the conflict over who will be our representatives, who will lead us, and what kind of policies our representatives will enact? And so, why don't you pause the video just for a second, take out a piece of paper and a pencil, and take a few minutes to think about ways that you've been involved in politics. And I encourage you to think outside the box. I mean, voting is obviously one way we're involved in politics, but are there other ways that you've been involved in the political and trying to influence who is elected, who serves us, and what kind of policies are going to be enacted? So while you were taking time to think about how you've participated politically, I took some time to sort of think about my life and how I've participated in politics as well. Well, I vote, so I think that's probably the main way a lot of us participate in politics. I have a pretty good voting record, vote in presidential elections, the midterm elections, local elections, primaries. I guess I like to vote. And we're going to be learning more about campaigns and elections in our final topic this semester. So you'll be learning about the types of elections that we have in our next and final a set of lectures. I've been a member of a political party and an interest group. And so while a political party can obviously send you information, get you informed on the candidates, it gets you involved in politics too, because if you're a member of a political party, sometimes people from the political party will reach out to you and ask you to do things such as donate or get involved in a campaign. I've been members of an interest group as well. And so like examples of interest groups, these are not necessarily the interest groups that I've been affiliated with, but the American Civil Liberties Union is a good example of an interest group. The National Rifle Association, the NRA, is a good example of an interest group. Greenpeace, the Sierra Club. Once I turned 50, I kept getting mailings from AARP, the American Association of Retired People. That's an interest group. So I've been a member of an interest groups or more than one. And that's getting involved in politics because you pay dues and then the interest groups will lobby on your behalf, right? That you are interested in gun rights, so you'll join the NRA and then the NRA will lobby lawmakers, raise interest or consciousness about gun rights. If you're ACLU, civil liberties, so if, you pay dues and then they use those dues to basically hire people to lobby and raise awareness about particular issues. It's a form of political participation. I've protested, so I've gotten out on the street and marched and protested, held signs. I've attended town halls. That's a form of political participation. I've listened to what lawmakers, have to say. I once, Russ Feingold, our former senator, used to have town halls in all of the counties throughout Wisconsin. And I remember going to one of his town halls and it wasn't just a one-way street. He'd tell us what he was doing, but then we would tell him what we wanted him to be doing, right? That's the participants at the town hall. And so again, that's a form of political participation. You're trying to influence your lawmaker to say, hey, these are our interests, try to enact those in DC. I've campaigned, I've knocked on doors, I've worked phone banks, I've donated money. And these days with the digital participation, as we're going to be talking about in a bit, it's a lot easier to get you on the phone or get you through email or get you to donate a few bucks, right? So that form of political participation kind of has increased. We'll be talking about that in a bit in terms of digital participation. Not this year, but last year, and ever since I've worked at UW Waukesha, I've hosted Debate Watch. So every time there's a presidential election year, and we even did it during pandemic, we did it virtually. We didn't do it face to face. We watched the presidential debates and then we discussed them afterwards. And that's a form of political participation because it gives people an opportunity to learn about the candidates and then discuss their positions in a public setting. I've posted articles on I've posted articles about political issues on Facebook. Again, digital political participation. But if I think an issue is interesting, I might post a fact-based article that I think others might enjoy learning about regarding a particular public policy or what have you. And it's my small way of sort of maybe trying to influence people and try to get them to think about politics or be knowledgeable about a certain public policy issue. So all the things I enumerated about myself in terms of political participation are all sort of the examples of the traditional forms of political participation that your textbook talks about. Voting, of course, a traditional form of political participation, campaign contributions, volunteering on a campaign, peaceful protests, strikes, and marches. All of these are age-old forms of participatory politics. And so make sure you read in your chapter as they go into more detail about each of these. So I want to make sure that we differentiated between the kinds of protests that are protected by the Constitution and by the law and the types of protests that are not. Now, peaceful protesting is legal and protected. That you have a constitutional right to peaceably assemble. And as long as your protest is abiding by, is peaceful and is abiding by the certain time, place, and manner ordinances that the city or the state may have in place about like when you can protest, what times, what the manner that you can protest it. And as long as you follow all of those rules, peaceful protesting is legal, protected, and it's a good form of political participation. However, when a protest turns violent, it is no longer a protected form of protesting. Rioting, looting, trespassing, the use of violence at a protest, that is not legal and it's not protected by the First Amendment. It very well may be a form of political participation, but it's not protected, and in fact you can be charged if the behaviors that you're engaging in are identified as criminal behaviors. So sometimes people, when they're protesting, they might feel that that their cause is so great and so important. They might feel that public policy has been, that there's been a long history of public policy that has disadvantaged a group of people. People might feel really angry about it, and that anger may turn into violence. It may very well draw attention to your political cause. It may turn people off from your political cause. So just to reiterate, it may be a form of political participation, but it's not protected, and you can be arrested for a crime if you engage in it. There, of course, have been, several examples recently of where peaceful and protected protesting transforms into something that is violent and illegal. And I put two pictures up there. One from the protests in Kenosha in 2020, following the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha. We're all very familiar with it, coming out of the verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse case. And while the vast majority of the protesters during the day in Kenosha were peaceful protesters, at night it was a different story. And so that's an example of a picture from how public city trucks were set on fire, and an example of the kinds of behaviors that are illegal. On the other side, we're well aware on January 6th, there was a big protest in Washington, D.C. in order to protest against what some people saw as a fraudulent election. And they gathered, they peacefully protest, but when they marched to the Capitol, it turned violent. And so, that's a picture of the rioters clashing violently with the police. Windows were broken. People entered into the Capitol in areas that they were not allowed. People were hurt. And so another example of the type of protesting that is not protected and is prohibited. In both of these instances, people have been have been arrested and they have been charged with crimes. In Kenosha, 55 people have been charged with a crime, the vast majority of which are from Kenosha. And in the case of January 6th, that federal prosecutors have charged more than 600 people with crimes related to the January 6th rioting. And they were from 40 states, so many states throughout the nation. So just some examples, and just wanting you to think critically about the difference between peaceful protesting and non-protected, illegal, violent protesting. So this is a graph that's in your textbook that just basically shows you the percentage of people who report participating in each of these activities. It won't come as a surprise that 79% of people report having voted in a general election. But you might be surprised for the percentage of people that have participated in these other activities. So, 42% of people say that they publicly express support for a campaign on social media. So it's kind of that new form of digital political participation. Contacted an elected official, 40%. I was sort of surprised by that. Attended a local government meeting, 30%. So I mean, you can kind of compare. I know a lot of you are youngins, and so you're not had lots of opportunities to get involved in politics. But you can just take a look at that and sort of compare yourself to those of the other humans. All right, now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the main way in which people participate politically, and that's through the process of voting. And so in the United States, so first just some terms. So the word suffrage, when you say suffrage, it's another way of talking about the right to vote, okay? And the right to vote is a legal right. Suffrage is a legal right. And so that in order to vote, the laws have to say that you are eligible, that you're legally eligible to vote. And today in the United States, for the most part, we have universal suffrage. In a second, we'll take a look at the constitutional amendments that have over time created that universal suffrage. That means just basically all adults have the right to vote. And even more precisely, all U.S. citizens have the right to vote. And so we have, for U.S. citizens, sort of universal suffrage. But that has not always been the case. The legal right to vote has, for much of the United States history, the legal right to vote, suffrage, was really quite restricted. And so I know that in our founding documents, it says that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. But one of those rights was not voting, I guess, from when this country was formed. But remember, once you put those words down on paper, then you just keep pushing and pushing and pushing until you open up that definition of equality more and more and more, right? It's a product of politics. It's a product of struggle. But when our nation started, not everybody could vote. African Americans who were held in slavery were not allowed to vote. Women were not allowed to vote. But also white men were not allowed to vote in many cases. Because at the beginning of the United States history, that there were property requirements that were put in place in order to, as a requirement for voting. The thinking was that only sort of those who have a stake in the system should be voting. And if you own property, you are like more invested in who's going to govern us and the kinds of policies that are going to be enacted. Now that's wrong-headed, but that was why there was this property requirement, right? It also was elitist, and it allowed a certain moneyed class to vote and keep the riffraff out, right? But yeah, you had to own property. That poll taxes were in place, which was basically a fee to vote. That is sort of like, hey, if you're going to vote, you have to put your little money where your mouth is, right? We have our property, you pay your fee. So there were poll taxes, literary tests. There were all these barriers to restrict voting. Now, that for the vast majority of voting is restricted at the state level until the federal government got involved and passed amendments to the United States Constitution. Whether or not you could vote was really based on the state that you lived in. So I teach Sex, Power, and Public Policy, we talked about how, while the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote our Constitution wasn't amended until 1920 to include that, some of the Western states that, as a process of Western expansion, that they allowed women to vote, much before 1920. The same is true with African Americans, that states like Massachusetts allowed African Americans to vote, right? I mean, so kind of depended on the state that you lived in. So states often took a lead in restricting suffrage. States would have laws limiting immigrants from voting in northern cities. And so as we have waves of European immigration coming into the northern cities like New York, local cities and states would put restrictions in place saying, nope, we don't want you participating in our politics. And so immigrants were restricted. And obviously laws preventing African Americans in the South from voting, even after the passage of the 15th Amendment, that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race when it comes to voting. As we well know from things we've read throughout the course of the semester and that you've read in your textbook when we were doing civil rights, that southern states in particular had restrictions in place like literacy tests, poll taxes, etc., that made it difficult for African Americans to exercise their 15th and 19th Amendment rights. So since states did have a lot of control over restricting voting rights, that there's a movement in the United States starting after the Civil War and moving forward from there to expand the legal right to vote in the United States and to make sure that basically we needed a national standard. We needed the Constitution to say that you can't restrict voting rights based on certain characteristics, and that once it's in the Constitution, all states' laws must abide and conform to what's in the Constitution. The 15th Amendment passed in 1870, and so we've got the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment that has the Equal Protection Clause in it, and then the 15th Amendment. All of these are the amendments that are known as the Civil War amendments. And the 15th Amendment makes it so that it's unconstitutional to abridge a person's vote based on their race or their previous condition of servitude. So it enfranchises Black folks. However, it doesn't enfranchise Black women. And enfranchising just means that you now have the right to vote. And so the 15th Amendment allows Black men to vote, but there was nothing prohibiting states from preventing women from voting. And so from 1870 to 1920, that while African American men had the right to vote, although let's keep it real, it was very difficult to exercise that vote, particularly in former Confederate states. When the true enfranchisement of African Americans doesn't take place until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But at this time, Black women and women, all women could be prohibited from voting based on what state they lived in. So the 19th Amendment ends that. It enfranchises women, and it expands suffrage to both all men and all women, at least legally by law. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically takes that constitutional right in the 15th Amendment and actually realizes it. And so it allows the federal government to challenge laws that affect minority voters, getting rid of legal barriers to voting in the southern states and beyond. The 24th Amendment, that I should have put that above the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that prohibits poll taxes, that is that fee to vote, which was that mechanism that was used to disenfranchise mostly African Americans in the South. And so that it prohibits poll taxes in federal elections. And then the 26th Amendment is a voting amendment. Look at how many amendments are dedicated to expanding suffrage in the United States. This is passed in 1971. You might be thinking, ooh, what's going on in 1971? Well, it's the Vietnam War. And so until the 26th Amendment was passed, states could say that they could have laws in their books saying that you needed to be 21 years or older and a so-called adult to vote. But as we know from the Vietnam War, there was a draft in place, and so people were getting, particularly men were only subject to the draft, were being drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. But if they were between the ages of 18 and 20, they didn't have any say in the people that were sending them to this war, right? And were prolonging the war. And so there was a political movement to lower the age, and that's what the 26th Amendment does. All right, so let's shift our sights now and take a look at a non-traditional form of political participation. Although at this point, the difference between non-traditional and traditional seems to become pretty dang blurry. But your textbook talks about this thing called digital political participation, and what digital political participation is that it's activities designed to influence politics using the internet. Okay, and so that could be visiting a candidate's website. Candidates now have websites, and so you can go to a candidate's website and you can learn about them. However, you can also leave them a message. You can send them an email. You don't need to actually show up to their office anymore. You can use their website. The internet is oftentimes used for organizing events. And it's a lot easier to let people know about an event and when it's happening via the internet and social media. I mean, you think about Black Lives Matter, a lot of why people were able to participate in Black Lives Matter protests, in particular during the pandemic, is because of the use of social media, right? And so it would say when it is, where you should show up, and it makes it easier for people to get to that to those events, and not just protests, but any kind of events. I mean, I remember back in the day, if there was a candidate forum, I mean, you'd have to be reading the local newspaper to find out about it. Now you can find out about a candidate forum just by getting on social media, particularly, depending on who you are following. You could sign an online petition. Political scientists don't know just how effective those online petitions are. However, if you see an online petition, you read about an issue, and you get politically aware about it, you may participate in different ways. And you can use social media to express support, right? Whether it's posting an article that you think is interesting from a particular political perspective, or you can, change your icon to be like reflecting an issue that you really care about. And in that way, you're expressing support, but that you're also raising awareness about the issue that you care about. And so this digital political participation is really becoming one of the most common ways for Americans to participate in politics outside of voting. So there are some real benefits to digital political participation. One is that digital political participation increases offline participation. And so you might be learning about candidates, or you might be learning about events. You might be learning about issues online. However, that once you learn about it online, there's opportunities to get involved offline, right? And so on social media, on election day, you'll get a lot of reminders to go vote, and then you take it offline and you actually go vote. Reminders or reach outs regarding campaign volunteering, opportunities to discuss politics, engage in a protest, attend a meeting, so that you actually got to go offline for the most part to do those. And it increases that. And the reason it increases it, like I mentioned before, you want to know about a candidate format. Back in the day, you had to read the newspaper. It's a lot easier to obtain information about meetings, candidates, candidate forums, protests via the web. And it also is sort of can be associated with sort of an accidental mobilization that, people find themselves interested in a topic that they didn't really know about. And then before they know it, they're pursuing, additional information. And so they start sort of getting information about stuff that they didn't even know they were interested in, because they are presented with it online. So it's can be accident. You didn't hey, I need to learn more about global warming and climate change and how I can reduce carbon emissions. I'm going to go on the internet and find out about it. To be oh, I didn't know about that, right? And then you're oh, I'm going to learn more. Okay, so while there are some good things about digital political participation, there are some drawbacks as well. One of the drawbacks, and we sort of talked about this in some of the material from our last topic on media and politics, is that digital political participation can create echo chambers and filter bubbles. And so, in other words, while you can get a lot of information on the online, depending on the way you organize your social media, if you're only following people on Twitter that align with your political perspective, or only engaging with people on Facebook that are aligned with your political perspective, that you're going to get information, but it's going to be incredibly one-sided, and it's not going to be challenged from the other perspective. And that can be very dangerous, right? When you're in an offline, environment, like at a town hall meeting, you're sort of forced to deal and talk with other people from other perspectives. Online digital modalities can really block a lot of those points of view from your view, and that can be kind of dangerous. Also, it increases polarization, right? So you got people, I'm in my media bubble with, my articles and my facts and my people, right? And this is what we believe, and none of y'all come over and challenge us, and you all over there are there with your wrong-headed ideas and your not real facts, right? And it just kind of increases that political polarization. So definitely a downside of digital political participation. Another thing is that anonymity in the digital world can lead to forums that can erode democracy. Back in the day, when we thought about really the benefits of online communication, you really think about it, you could bring people together from all walks of life from throughout the world, and you could discuss issues and get a lot of different perspectives. Well, not only because of just wanting to be in our own echo chamber, that doesn't happen, but when we actually do try to debate each other online, it just turns out to be a effing shit show. Excuse my language, right? But I don't. It is that, and so people online become hateful, ugly people who say things that they would never say in the real world. And it has a capacity to, harm others. It can have a capacity to shame others. It just basically has the capacity to create a really toxic environment that is eroding of the values that we need to live in a democratic society: compromise, treating other people with respect, etc. Well, where we are with the internet today, a lot of that doesn't happen. And then finally, digital political participation. If we politically participate online and find out about candidates, well, then that online information can be vulnerable to foreign interference. And we saw that happen with the 2016 election. Russia interfered with the 2016 election, in particular online, using bots to promote misinformation. And you can read more about that in your chapter. They talk about it. Russia's always wanted, and the Soviet Union has always interfered in American politics. It's just a lot easier to do that interference when you're able to interfere online. Okay, so in conclusion, let's just think critically and make some connections to other things we talked about this semester. So maybe think about, how did your parents serve as agents of socialization regarding political participation? Did your parents campaign? Did your parents knock on doors? Did your parents, vote? And if so, how did that influence you? And if not, how did that influence you? Do you feel that the benefits of the digital participation outweigh the potential harms? And even if they are harmful, what are some tactics that you could personally use to make sure that you shield yourself from those harms? And the next lecture, we're going to be taking a look at voter turnout. All right, thanks for paying attention. I appreciate it.